Hello and welcome to today's PowerPoint entitled The Cold War Wanes. This PowerPoint is really going to be about basically the end of the Cold War, which again, if we had more time in class, we'd spend a little bit more time talking about the different aspects of, but really I'm just trying to give you guys the big picture here. So without further ado, here we go. So from what we have talked about so far, how has the world been changed by the Cold War? What kind of things have changed the world? What's gone on because of the Cold War? What events would have not happened if not for the Cold War? That's kind of what I want you guys to think about throughout today, throughout this kind of lesson, all that sort of stuff. So, first up, the space race. The space race is one of my favorite parts of the Cold War because it's got one of my favorite kind of historical figures, Yuri Gagarin. Space race is also really cool because it kind of is what brings the US into this can-do attitude. So the Soviets were, for a very long time, winning the space race. They were the ones to send the first animal into space. It's a small dog named Laika. They were the first man in space in orbit, who was Soviet Yuri Gagarin. He was in space months before the United States sent anyone up there. Also, there's a common phrase attributed to him in which they say that Yuri Gagarin, when he was up in space, said that basically he was in space and he looked around and he didn't see God up there. Yuri Gagarin, although he never really claimed to be a very religious person, has said that he never said that it was kind of a quote misattributed to him. So one of the most famous quotes about space travel, all that sort of stuff, wasn't even real, which I find interesting, not because of any religious aspects, but just because it's space. The Soviets were also the first to send a woman into space, Valentina Tereshkova, in 1963. They're also the ones to do a first spacewalk. And a spacewalk is basically someone who's outside of a satellite or a ship moving throughout space, tethered to the ship, but not on the ground. That was also a Soviet. That was Alexei Leonov in 1965. Now, if you know your space history or just your general history, you'll know what happens in 1969. Before that, though, one of JFK's most famous speeches was basically telling American people that we would be on the moon by the end of the decade. And sure enough, we were. Now, the Americans were the first to land on the moon. Specifically, Neil Armstrong was the first American, the first person to land on the moon. And he is attributed with one of the more famous sayings about space: one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Now, shortly following him on the moon was Buzz Aldrin, who was also American. He's also basically the namesake of Buzz from Toy Story. It's Buzz Aldrin. Now, Michael Collins was the third member of the Apollo 11 mission, but he was the one basically piloting the ship around the moon. So while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were on the moon, Michael Collins was still kind of going around. Now, one of the more interesting things about the moon landing is that only 12 people in all of human history have stepped foot on the moon. And every single one of those people has been an American. There's been no one else that has set foot on the moon, which is really interesting to me because in space travel and the space flights, a lot of countries have said that they're going to do a manned mission to the moon. I believe China and India both have said that they're planning a manned mission to the moon, but they still haven't done it yet. Those plans have been in the work for, I think, 5 years now. But the moon, after Americans land on the moon, we sent a couple more missions up there. But after a while, people kind of lose interest in the moon, and now the focus is kind of on Mars. But the space race, even though the Soviets had won all these milestones, the final win, people walking on the moon, went to the Americans, so the Americans won the space race. Because even if you're in first the entire race, if someone passes you on that finish line, you still came in second. That's kind of how the space race went. Now, the Apollo-Soyuz was a US-USSR joint program. So the two worked together, they met in space, and they shook hands. This was a really symbolic moment because it showed that the US and the Soviet Union could work together after years of fighting, after this huge race to go up to space, to land on the moon. You have in space the shaking of hands, this kind of truce, which is really cool. I wish we had more time to talk about the space race because there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of really cool stuff with the space race, but we just really don't have the opportunity to. Now, in October of 1973, we're kind of shifting topics here away from space and looking more towards the Middle East. So in October 1973, Egypt and Syria attack Israel and request Soviet aid. In response, well, the attack was in response to Israel's capture of the Sinai Peninsula and Golan Heights. Israel invades Syria and Egypt within 2 weeks of basically being invaded. Israel and Egypt accept a ceasefire proposed by the United States and in 1974 agreed to disengagement along the Suez Canal. This is important, but the U.S. gets involved. There's not a major war. This is also good because the last couple times the U.S. has gotten involved, it hasn't gone so well. In 1975, Israel agrees to leave the Sinai Peninsula, and 7 years later they invade Lebanon. Israel is doing a lot of invading, a lot of attacking. In December of 1979, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan. Now, their plan was basically to try and keep the ally of the Soviet of Afghanistan. Soviet Union wanted to keep Afghanistan as an ally, and they reluctantly invaded and faced fierce aggression from a kind of militia called the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were very well armed. They were actually pretty decent combat-wise against the Soviets. And I know it's confusing to say that they wanted to retain the ally. Basically, there were two groups within Afghanistan that were vying for control. One side was on the side of the Soviet Union, one side was on the side of the US, and Soviet Union said, well, to make sure that they don't basically side with the US, we should invade, make sure that our buddies stay in power, and it just really didn't work out. It just became a mess. In January of 1989, Soviet troops withdrew from Afghanistan. This was a decade-long conflict, which is really important because it set the stage for Afghanistan in the 90s and the 2000s. And in this kind of conflict, the Soviets put a lot of weapons and a lot of training into Afghanistan, which, if you know more about modern history, proves to be not a very good thing to do. Now, around the world during the Cold War, in April 1965, U.S. Marines were sent to the Dominican Republic. Why? Basically to overthrow. In September 1973, the U.S. aids in a Chilean coup. Basically, a sector of Chilean officials wanted to overthrow the government. The U.S. said, hey, sure, we'll send in troops to help out. In April of 1975, the Khmer Rouge seized control of Cambodia and committed a genocide of anyone that was part of the old regime or ties to foreign governments, specifically the U.S. and Soviet Union. This is referred to as the killing fields. Now, the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, all that, there's a lot of kind of issue and discussion about this. A lot of people say that Pol Pot killed people with glasses because he thought that they were intellectuals. It's a small exaggeration, but he did kill anyone who's an intellectual or basically could be a detractor from his power. In December of 1978, Vietnam invaded Cambodia. They removed the government and they occupied the country for a decade. In October of 1983, the U.S. invaded and overthrew a regime in Grenada. The U.S. really, really likes to invade and overthrow regimes during the 70s and 80s, well, the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's kind of our deal. This is a picture from the kind of Killing Fields Museum. It is basically a Golgotha of just skulls and bones piled up, showing the victims and the number of victims. Now, the fall of the Soviet Union. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev comes up with these two ideas, glasnost and perestroika, which basically come together to mean transparent, clear, communicative government and a restructuring of Soviet Union politically and economically. These are both really important. In October of '86, Gorbachev and President Reagan agreed to remove all intermediate missiles from Europe. Basically, this is a huge step because no longer are missiles kind of pointing at each other and each other's allies. In 1987, all medium and short range missiles are removed. In the middle of 1989, Poland and Hungary gained their independence. In November of 1989, the Berlin border opened and the Berlin Wall was demolished, primarily by residents of Berlin, which is actually really funny why this happens. It was basically a mistake. The guy giving the meeting was basically talking about when the wall would open, all this sort of stuff, when the border would open. Someone asked him when it would open. He said, oh, immediately. And so people rushed to the wall and started climbing over it. It's kind of a very important mistake in history. In December of 1989, communist governments fail in East Europe. Once the wall comes down, basically other communist governments in other countries start to fall. Specifically, March of 1990, Lithuania gains its independence. In May of 1990, Boris Yeltsin is elected the president of Russia. He introduced his market policies, basically capitalist policies, free press, and Western pop culture. And in August of 1991, the end of the Soviet Union, the renaming of it to Russia, and the official end of the Cold War. Now, answering the following question, and this is a nice map kind of showing the difference that 2 years can make between 1989 and 1991. Now, I want to leave you guys with this question. In what ways did the Cold War change the world? And there's all sorts of stuff you can talk about, or you can think about space exploration, you can think about culture, you can think about politics, you can think about borders, maps, all this sort of stuff. And it's really interesting to talk about, and I really wish we could spend more time on it. I really do. But with that, I will leave you guys for the day. I hope you have a good rest of your day and a productive week.